Well, in most churches across the land that are more liturgical in nature, it is the Reign of Christ Sunday. But I have a kind of a thing that when you come up to the Sunday before Thanksgiving and everybody's mind's focused upon family and whether or not Uncle John's going to say something to offend somebody, or whether somebody's going to tell an off-colored joke at the table, or whether, God help us all, politics should break out in the conversations. People's minds are on Thursday. Most of the time, I don't relish bringing civic observances into a place of worship. But this one really does seem always right, especially if you've ever spent time reading or praying the Psalms. And it always seems right to me that whatever else that we do during that week leading up to Thanksgiving, that it seems as if it's a good time to do some remembering and giving personal thanks for those things in our lives, those people in our lives, those events in our lives that have blessed us, that have molded us and changed us. Those moments in which we just simply knew by way of enfleshment of what the other person gives to that moment, that God's steadfast love really does endure forever, because we feel it in a very incarnational way, enfleshed out before us. So I think I've done this before, but several weeks ago when I was looking toward this day, I thought, well, just visit this again. And then invite you to do some thinking, not just here, but when you go out these doors and in the days to come, to take a pause. Just take a minute when you're sitting at the traffic light, or when you're waiting for some salesperson to try to straighten out a problem in India that they're never going to straighten out, whatever it is. Just take a minute and do some inventory for yourselves about how that love is fleshed out for you. And I got to say, for me, I always have to start with thanksgiving for the place and the time and the family system that I was raised, brought up in. Now, I've spent many years of my life analyzing, criticizing, thinking about how crazy my family is. Especially those that I never, thank God, had the privilege of meeting. All those drunk great uncles that died, who actually shot up a bunch of people along the Texas-New Mexico border and then had to get out on an appeal, and only because they had a racist judge where they let go and came back home to the mountains of North Carolina to drink themselves to death. Those kind of folk. That's why I'm such a lovely pastor. I got all that stuff going for me. But as a child growing up in a family where the theology may not have been what I would have liked for it to be, though then I didn't know, there was an ongoing attempt in the family to help us understand the power of the story behind our spirituality. We would groan at nighttime when Mom would gather us around the old Siegler heater stove and make us sit there for our final nightly devotions. Like, what is this? But we groaned and we sat and we listened and we heard the stories. I don't know how many times I heard about those sorry Amalekites getting wiped out, or doing damage to somebody else, but we listened to him over and over again. And how great King David was, even though, my mom always seemed to overlook the fact that he was pretty much a murderer and accumulated wives and concubines galore. He was he was a person after God's own heart. I remember my grandparents' front yard, 2 massive cedar trees. And in the summer evenings when you could barely run through the yard without running into, as we call them, lightning bugs. And just before dusk, because you didn't want to really be caught out there in the dark, at the end of this long field where they planted corn and tomatoes and even some burley tobacco, even though my grandfather always preached to my grandmother about her dipping snuff, he grew tobacco. God only judged her for using the snuff, not him for growing it. But we could get out to that orchard and pick fresh apples. And there was just joy everywhere, wading in the creek. I am grateful for those experiences that my daughters never had an opportunity to experience. And yet I always remind myself that they, in their minds, have experiences that they honor and bless that are just as rich for them, even though it's different. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for a church that nurtured me along the way. I don't know how many times teachers had to put up with my practicing the art of spitballing. I don't know how many times that I was reported to my parents because Reverend K. Allen's grandson should know better than to do the kinds of things he was doing. But they were gracious and they were patient and they were tolerant because they always thought if we work hard enough, maybe he won't be quite as bad as we think he is. That's grace. The capacity to grant grace. We've lost the capacity in our society to give each other grace. Just grace. The gift of acceptance where we might say, this person's a little strange, or this person's, but I need to let this person know that he or she is important to me because this person's important to God. I'm grateful that I received that where I was out of the church that I grew up in. They taught me that. I'm grateful for a pastor who was worried about my soul because when I was prepared to go off to college, and my mom never thought I would get into college, and I fooled her, I was prepared to go off to the University of North Carolina, Asheville. In 1969, when my parents thought the heathens were taking over the world. And I was going to go over there, and my pastor felt like my soul was endangered. And went down to this little Baptist college in August and talked my way in. And they had very little financial aid, and I needed it all because my parents had nothing. And there I met these incredible professors whose souls I was determined to save because I knew that they had to be liberal professors and Jesus needed for them to turn from their sins. And people like me who were turned by the grace of those professors who loved us and put up with us and taught us a different narrative than many of us grew up with. Who were scholars committed to the task, and many of whom ended up being fired by an administration who was more concerned about raising money than truth. But they persisted. They, as I said last Sunday, had integrity. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for seminary. Oh, yes, the professors who were really great and all that stuff, but I'm really grateful that I got a chance to do some real sinning in seminary because I was kind of breaking away from some of that cultural boundaries that I'd grown up with to have some fun. But along the way, for churches that put up with the fact that I didn't know as much as I presumed to know, and were patient enough to simply love and receive my gifts and return their gifts to me. Sometimes when people get into ministry, those early churches, I find that we forget. We forget how gracious they were, because they didn't become the saints in our minds that we thought they should, those little country churches. And all along, they were the saints who had received us and were transforming us as they received our gifts and as we tried to work polishing those gifts. God's steadfast love endures forever. I'm grateful that I was able to live in all kinds of precarious places. It's not the places, but it's how foolish I was in those places. That I was able to survive being capsized in the middle of the Delaware Bay with my dad when we wondered if we'd ever get rescued. I'm grateful that having had numerous encounters, close encounters, not of the third kind, but of the rattlesnake kind, I seemed to draw rattlesnakes to me. And I never went to, services where I handled snakes. I only attended one time and never went back. I'm grateful that in those precarious situations I survived, and that somehow in surviving, I was able to claim a spirit of thanksgiving in those moments for that somehow allowed me to give back to those whom I loved the gifts that I wanted to give. Because, when you have those moments, it makes you aware of how precious life is. It really does. I'm grateful for all of that. I'm grateful that I've said this before, but listen to me. I'm grateful that there's a denomination called the United Church of Christ that took me in. Probably the only other bunch of people who could be that tolerant in the United Church of Canada. I joked when I went up to do a workshop in Winnipeg years ago on urban ministry that it seemed strange to be in a room of people who call themselves UCC and to know that there were people there that were left of me. I say this because not only did this church receive me in and gave me the freedom and the congregations therein, they gave me the freedom to work out my theologies along the way as they worked their theologies out with me. And as they put up sometimes with pronouncements and resolutions that they never really understood, that all along there is a witness that goes on that sometimes makes people mad, but a witness that is incredibly empowering to people who are outside the walls of the church, who need to know that the church stands for something more than what it stands against. Recently, you may have missed this because it didn't get a lot of coverage in the national press, but recently, there's a group of churches in Chicago area led by Trinity UCC, and there were some Baptist churches, a few on the west side of Chicago, and the denomination, who always is struggling for funding. They got together and they got with an organization that worked with this kind of thing, and they found families, actually almost 6,000 families, who made about half of what the nation's poverty level is, but who had medical debt hanging over them. And they negotiated with the healthcare systems and paid off the debt, pennies on the dollars, but the corporation figured we're not going to get anything anyway. Let's get this. They paid off the debt, medical debts of just under 6,000 people. And so this year at Christmas time, there are people living on the edge who no longer have to face the door knocking and the telephone calls. And life is already hard enough when you're living at half the poverty level in Chicago. But on top of that, when somebody says, here, here, this will take some of the burden off of you, then you got to say thanks be to God, because God's steadfast love endures forever. In the Florida conference, this will be the last part of this commercial. I'm going to give this commercial because I think Pat will appreciate it. In the state of Florida for years, the Florida conference has been engaged with the Immokalee workers way over in the middle of nowhere on the southwest side of the state. Farm workers. Organizing farm workers. They have built this coalition with the farm owners over there. That's quite astounding. And what's happened is it's transformed life for the field workers. The number of rapes and abuse of women in the fields has dropped incredibly to reporting of maybe 2 a year. And in the past, there'd be hundreds of incidents of women being raped. This coalition has stood firm for justice and improved the quality of life for those folk over there. Now, here's the thing. The good people who have the money in Immokalee don't want these people to have housing in the town of Immokalee. They want to use their labor because, by the way, these people are citizens of this country. They want to use their labor. They just don't want them to live near them. So a piece of property came available, and somebody had a conscience and contacted, and with the Florida Conference and a group of Presbyterians and some money from the National Church, and if the Florida Conference can raise enough money to fill the gap, they're going to buy that property. And when they do, when the people have property, then the Cornerstone Fund, with whom we have investments, by the way, that we do pretty well with those investments, the Cornerstone Fund will be able to loan them the money to build quality housing for people who live in that community, work in that community, and sustain that community. I'm proud of that work because nobody cares about these people elsewhere. But day by day, they build that for themselves. I'm proud to be part of that. I know that nobody wants labels anymore, and nobody wants to hear company logos, and nobody wants to care about what church you belong to and what denomination it is. I get that. I just need to stop this morning in this sermon of Thanksgiving. I'm getting toward the end. My voice is getting toward the end. But I wanted you to know how proud I am that these people took me in and loved me through the years, and these churches have been good to me and have provided me opportunities for ministry, and together we have made a difference in terms of the kind of justice we have worked for. Amen. We forget that. We think it's only when people say something that makes us mad that we should pay attention. We forget how much good gets done in our name with our support. And to that, I want to say thanks be to God. Is that a good enough commercial, Pat? Now, I give thanks for that. I know I left out my family, my present family, but I wouldn't do that. I just get mushy and crying when I do that. It's like watching one of those tender movies, and Chris looks over at me because she knows I'm crying. If I talk too much about my daughters, I'm thankful. I'm just thankful. Howard Hanger wrote a piece on gratitude, and I'll close with this. Oh, did I forget? There's one more thing before I close. I'm thankful for Cocoa Beach Community Church. I'm thankful that people are committed, that when things get tough and we need to come together to take care of building stuff, that you're there. I'm thankful that you're there so that people in the community know that we believe in hospitality and inclusion, and we're going to stand with that witness. I am glad that you come here with joyful, open hearts, and you receive each other and sip and break bread with each other and love each other, and then are able to bear witness into the larger community that this is a place where people are welcome. Can I get an amen there? Amen. Gratitude. If the only prayer you ever prayed was thank you, that would suffice. Quote old Meister Eckhart. And why would he make such an outlandish statement? First, he was a mystic. And it's the job of every mystic to make outlandish statements. And secondly, Meister Eckhart must have sensed that gratitude opens the door to the fullness of life. Gratitude leads you to the spring of healing water. Gratitude boogies you out to the shadows, out of the shadows and onto the dance floor so you can hear the music. Gratitude is the link you click to get online with God. Even Mr. Messed Up on Women's issue, Apostle Paul, had the clarity to say, in all circumstances, give thanks. In all circumstances, which ain't no easy matter when you think about it. But the wisdom is solid. Gratitude brings peace into turmoil, hope into despair, wholeness into brokenness. Even Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, the night he was slandered, beaten, and murdered, gave thanks. It could be argued that gratitude opens the way to resurrection. No matter what, gratitude works. Join with me with one final phrase. What? God's steadfast love endures forever. Amen.